In spite of a ceasefire, more violence threatens the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. As the death toll nears 100 in the latest border clashes, many fear a large-scale conflict could ensue. But is a sustainable peace possible with valuable water sources and disputed frontiers at stake? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border clashes. It marks the worst violence in years, but certainly not the first instance of conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Last week's clashes on the border between the two former Soviet republics left tens of thousands displaced and dozens dead, including women and children. Fighting broke out last week just as the leaders of both countries and Russia met nearby in Uzbekistan for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Russian President Vladimir Putin called for no further escalation, urging the leaders to work through diplomatic means. But the fighting continued, even while both agreed to a ceasefire. Each accuses the other of breaching the agreement, but on Sunday, Kyrgyz authorities said the situation at the border remained calm. Well, Kyrgyzstan's president, Sadyr Japarov, called on his country to unite following the clashes, saying they will work to resolve the issue only in a peaceful way.
Contentious issues related to the borders of our state are gradually being resolved. As you know, all the areas on the borders with the Republic of Uzbekistan have been settled, and all that remains is for them to be officially documented. Today, only the territories bordering the Republic of Tajikistan are not specified and cause problems. We are continuing our efforts to settle the contentious issues on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border, only in a peaceful way.
Well, thanks in part to Stalin-era demarcation, the borders between former Soviet Central Asian republics can be confusing at best. Enclaves and intertwining frontiers mean parts of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan lie within Kyrgyzstan's greater borders, and valuable water sources run through and within several countries, causing conflict not just between nations, but also between neighbors.
The reason for the attack is not clear to us. After all, we did not take away their land, water, and we did not block their roads, as if Hitler himself gave the command to his dogs and stepped on us himself.
So why haven't ceasefires brought an end to the fighting, and what could resolve this decades-old dispute once and for all? Joining me now to debate that are from Bishkek, Kadyr Toktogulov, the former ambassador of Kyrgyzstan to the US and Canada. Also from the Kyrgyz capital is Aijan Sharshenova. She is a political analyst specializing in EU and Russian policy in Central Asia. And from Los Angeles, Steve Swerdlow. He is an associate professor of human rights at the University of Southern California and a Central Asian affairs analyst. Now, we also reached out to various agencies of the Tajik government, hoping they would participate on this program, but our invitations were declined. So let me begin with just saying it was actually interesting to hear that one villager we featured say that they don't even know what started this fighting. So let me start by asking if any of you were actually surprised by how severe this latest escalation became and what you believe actually sparked it. Aijan, go ahead.
Thank you. To be honest, I did not expect violence of this scale. It was quite unexpected as well, given that both President Rahmon and President Japarov attended the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, and they had a bilateral meeting as well as numerous opportunities to discuss border issues in a multilateral format. So it is quite surprising that those issues have not been raised at the summit, that the attack started early on the morning of the 16th. There were some clashes on the 14th of September, but the heaviest shelling happened on the 16th and 17th of September, coming from the Tajik side. The toll is very high. There are reports about over 100 people dying on both sides, 59 on the side of Kyrgyzstan, 41 on the side of Tajikistan so far.
Right.
And for Kyrgyzstan, this was the case of the highest or the largest evacuation effort. And the situation is nearing humanitarian crisis, because all of a sudden we have 136,000 internally displaced people who have to be accommodated in the southern parts, the safe southern parts of Kyrgyzstan, as well as in Bishkek.
Okay.
So it is quite big scale.
Ambassador, were you equally surprised? And any thoughts on what truly did spark this latest escalation?
Yes, of course. As Aijan said, that this was actually the extent of the damages. I mean, and the fact that it actually took place while the two presidents of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were in Samarkand for the meeting of heads of state of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was quite shocking. But clearly, one of the causes of this deadly conflict is unfinished border delimitation process. We between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, we still have about 50% of the borders to be resolved, border issues to be resolved, and it's been taking. The process has been taking place since the two countries gained independence in 1991. With water resources and two countries sharing very densely populated region, Fergana Valley. These are primary causes for such situation that we've been seeing actually quite regularly now.
I want to speak in more detail in a minute about the demarcation issues. But Steve, let me raise it with you because we've heard it now from both our other panelists. The timing is so curious because it broke out just as both presidents were attending the SCO summit in Uzbekistan. And last year's fighting actually broke out while both countries' defense ministers were attending a CTSO meeting in Dushanbe, in the Tajik capital. Is that just a coincidence, or are both leaders actually going into these meetings, particularly the SCO, knowing violence was erupting?
Well, it's going to take some time, I think, to examine who knew what when, but you're right, it's absolutely striking and really even underlines how tragic, more tragic this is, that you had these scenes of the presidents of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan sitting comfortably next to one another at this Samarkand summit, which was supposed to hail how a regional security organization could maybe bring peace and stability, while civilians, as Aijan said, now double the number of those that died in 2021 were being killed, including children, and also over 100,000 displaced in Kyrgyzstan. And what I think that does is just really underline the irrelevance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and show the extent to which this situation has become more and more violent, more complicated. The levels of distrust on both sides have increased over the past several years and really decades. This has been going since the 1930s, if you look far back enough. And I think it shows that we're speculating in terms of we can't really get inside the heads of the military planners that arranged this. But I think that is certainly being discussed hot and heavy on social media, that this was planned, that it was prearranged. Of course, we don't know that, and the current focus should be on the civilian toll and the humanitarian.
I understand, but I mean, it is, they say they can't determine if this has been arranged. But Aijan, I mean, none of these militaries will take that kind of armed action without the approval of those in power. So again, did these leaders both go into these meetings knowing that effectively, a war battle was about to break out?
Well, I would say for certain one of them did know what is going to happen. And you're absolutely right that the military cannot start an invasion of this sort without consulting with the highest political leadership. So I don't buy it that the leaders, or the leader who launched the attack wouldn't actually know about that. And especially if you look at the casualties on the Kyrgyz side, of course, the reports are still coming from the Tajik side, and we're still to learn more about the nature of casualties, number of casualties, and so on and so forth. But on the Kyrgyz side, if you look at the military losses or the losses from non-civilian population, most of the losses, the casualties, are the members of the border services. So obviously they have been standing there at the border doing the regular job. There were not many military from what I have seen so far, which means that there have not been any military personnel or large military presence on the Kyrgyz side of the border, which raises a question. The same applies with the unexpectedness of the whole issue because it clearly caught a large number of population of Batken region by surprise.
Right.
And in addition to Batken region, where clashes happen regularly, there was bombing of Batken's region center, the city of Batken, which is 10 kilometers away from the border. It's not disputed. It's an administrative center of the region. And in addition, there was the Osh region affected, which is away from Batken region. So this raises a lot of questions.
Aijan, yeah, and let me ask you then, what are these ceasefires? Are they actual agreements, or are they just the military being given orders to temporarily stop fighting?
To be honest, this is a very good question. I think that should be asked to the military, to be honest, because those ceasefires have been happening twice, 3 times a day, negotiated by both the highest leadership, the military leadership on the ground, on Tajik and Kyrgyz side, negotiated between the heads of Batken region and Sugd region in Tajikistan. So I think the problem is not negotiating a ceasefire. The problem is sticking to it, and that's not happened yet.
Ambassador,
the last couple of days have been quiet, but we're still to see what's going to happen next.
Ambassador, let me come back to you. As I noted at the beginning of this panel discussion, we tried very hard to get someone from the Tajik government to join this program. We couldn't, but they did send a statement, and I want to read you part of the statement from the Tajik Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding what they call the aggression of the Kyrgyz Republic. It says, in recent days, with a view to creating the image of an aggressor in the face of its neighbor, the Kyrgyz side, not shunning outright lies and insinuations, continues an information campaign against Tajikistan, thereby escalating tension on the border, in the border area. On September 17th, in his address to the nation, the president of Kyrgyzstan used the word enemy in relation to Tajikistan. I want you to clarify that. Does Kyrgyzstan see Tajikistan as an enemy here?
Well, in this, I mean, we've had this, we had a similar situation in the spring of 2021, and certainly the latest, the latest deadly attack by Tajikistan, and then the conflict that we had at the border, certainly does not, present, Tajikistan as a neighboring and friendly country. And that is why the Minister of Foreign Affairs also said in its statement that this was outright aggression. And, in relations between two countries, especially when both of them are members, full members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is led by Russia, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by China and Russia, you have this deadly confrontation between two countries. That's certainly not something that friendly, neighbors do. And in Kyrgyzstan, that is clearly the view that Tajikistan has not been a good neighbor and friend in the past few months, for sure. I mean, at least since 2021, when we had very serious situation, and also a lot of people were killed on the Kyrgyz side. Okay.
Let's talk then about the border issue, the demarcation. Steve, I'll come back to you. Is there an obvious way to demarcate here? Is there a better way to draw these borders, or is this going to be a seamlessly never-ending problem?
Well, I think as Aijan said earlier, this issue, of course, it is a complicated Soviet legacy that both sides have inherited, and there have been maps on both sides, again, dating back to the Soviet days, which is difficult. But the key issue here is one of political will. It's more political, I think. We have on the one side a relatively new government in Kyrgyzstan in power since 2020, which of course has had its own challenges. And some of the figures in the Kyrgyz government have been blamed by some for at times using populist rhetoric. On the other hand, though, on the other side of this, in Tajikistan, and I should say, of course, Kyrgyzstan is a democracy with a vibrant civil society, where you've had during this conflict bloggers, journalists, civil society activists able to really highlight what is happening and organize a humanitarian response, which has been really inspiring to watch that solidarity. On the other hand, though, you have in Tajikistan a hardcore authoritarian state, the president of Tajikistan in power really since 1992 or 1994, depending how you calculate it, and an abysmal human rights crackdown. Very difficult to actually figure out what's happening because journalists have been imprisoned. In fact, today, as we record this, one of the leading journalists in the country is on trial, Fathonim Mamadshoeva, and there's been another deadly crackdown in another area of Tajikistan just a month earlier in the Pamir region. So you have a situation that's very conducive in Tajikistan to a hardening of rhetoric, to more and more nationalism, as I said, an authoritarian situation. So I think that's going to really complicate any of these efforts to negotiate a peace along the border, which is also a complicated issue in terms of land and water and identity.
Yeah, I mean, and on that, I mean, first of all, I have to say the Tajik government really doesn't do itself any favors by making it so difficult to get into the country and then communicate with any government officials and to really understand what I'm going to ask you, Steve, quickly. What is Tajikistan after? What do they want? What does Kyrgyzstan want, for that matter? What would be the result of fighting with their neighbor to get what?
Yeah, that is a great question. And some have speculated that again, this is a way for the president to consolidate a power base. It's a way to. Some have speculated that his son is rumored to take power very soon, to be passed. A succession scheme is being developed, and some have speculated that this campaign and other campaigns in Tajikistan have been in an effort to sort of extinguish any lingering security threats from the father to the son. But we don't know for sure. It also may be, though, that obviously there is a fraught situation. There's land issues, water issues, and as I said, identity is at stake here. But I really think that it's hard to figure out what President Rahmon is after here. And it seems, I think, that the paranoid nature of his authoritarian president seems to be becoming more and more clear in this context. In terms of what Kyrgyzstan is going through, I think I'd leave that to Aijan and Ambassador Toktogulov to comment.
Right. Aijan, I'll come back to you then. I mean, if you can include as well, how much are local people actually fighting over resources in the area? How much ethnic difference is there in the immediate region? Could you compare any of this to, ethnic tensions we've seen boil over in other parts of the world? How much is that element at play?
Right. Regarding the fighting over the resources, that happens quite regularly. We cannot deny that. This is a yearly occurrence when the local farmers would usually dispute the access to water. However, this situation is very much different from the previous clashes, border clashes, because this was a premeditated, organized attack on a sovereign nation. Regarding the ethnic composition, it's actually quite diverse in the south of Kyrgyzstan. So as you know, the borders have been drawn in the Soviet times, and the dispute is usually, the core of it is that Tajikistan refers to the Soviet maps of the 1920s, 1930s, and Kyrgyzstan refers to the maps of 1950s. So it's quite difficult to agree which map is the right one. But if you look beyond that or before that, the region, specifically that part of the Central Asian region, has been very much ethnically diverse. It lays on the Silk Road, so obviously that's the melting pot of Eurasia, really, not even Central Asia. And nations have been living there side by side for centuries, if not thousands of years. So obviously it's all this interconnected. So when we hear about ethnic clashes, I don't think that should be the case. I don't think the identity is the highest contributing factor. Because, for example, when the whole thing happened and Batken residents were fleeing the area, Uzbekistan provided a safe corridor through Sohan Cliff. And the Sohan Cliff is populated by majority Tajiks. And they were handing bread and drinks on the way to the passing cars with Batken refugees. So that clearly demonstrates that Uzbekistan showed goodwill, that Tajiks of Uzbek citizenship showed goodwill, that
Okay.
Kyrgyz trusted them and accepted the food and drinks from them. So I don't think that the ethnic part, but obviously,
But
given the information wars and so on and so forth, this might spark. I think it's more about the aftermath of the conflict than people actually on the ground. I don't think people on the ground would have those problems.
what about specifically the water resources, though? There's the Gulnovoy water intake facility that seems to be at the center of a lot of the provocations and how that water is distributed, especially going forward when water is becoming a more and more valuable resource.
It is indeed. And given the past few years, there have been quite a few issues with climate change as well. So there were droughts, there were issues with the lack of drinking water. But obviously, a lot of resources have been invested, including by the international organization, into the water management in the region. But clearly, that does not achieve some sort of final resolution because it's a continuous negotiation process, it's continuous compromises, and they don't always go smooth.
Okay.
But again, this was the case before. Now, I don't think the water was the issue because that's the end of the harvesting season. You need water in April and May, and that's usually when the clashes between the locals would happen because they were needing the water to water the farming lands. But this is September now. They are collecting the harvest.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure how water would play the trigger in this particular situation.
So, Ambassador, how confident are you that diplomacy and negotiations can work this out? Because, as you know, there is speculation that much of this could lead to large-scale warfare.
There's always this risk, and in Kyrgyzstan we do realize this, but diplomacy should and must be the only way forward to resolve all these border issues. You know, Kyrgyzstan has 4 neighbors, and we have completed and concluded our border negotiations with 3 of them, with Uzbekistan being the 3rd one. And we have that practice, and we have this history of actually having difficult border negotiations with our neighbors, such as China. Kazakhstan, we have our border delimited and demarcated. And with Uzbekistan, I mean, just recently when Uzbekistan had its new president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan negotiated at record pace to come to the, to 85% of borders being sort of agreed upon. So we do have that practice, and Kyrgyzstan is not sort of excluding Tajikistan from that kind of goodwill and good neighbor approach. Okay. I looked at what Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs said of Tajikistan said just yesterday at a news conference where he accused Kyrgyz government of being, of not engaging properly and constructively on this issue, and that is actually not probably the right, definitely not the right way to describe the attitude and approach that the Kyrgyz government has had towards border negotiation.
What about the potential role foreign powers could play in this, particularly in negotiations, especially when it comes to Russia and China, for better or worse?
Well, Kyrgyzstan definitely, on all the cases, on all the instances of border negotiation, has done this through bilateral negotiation and engagement, and that is actually the priority for Kyrgyzstan. The 2 neighbors have to figure it out on their own without having a third party involved, because at the end of the day, it's our 2 countries that have to live side by side in peace. But it is no secret that Moscow has a significant influence sort of in terms of security issues in the region. So they definitely would want to play a role, and it's up to Tajikistan and up to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to actually decide as to how much room we would like to give to a third party.
I mean, Steve, do you think it's possible for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to do this bilaterally, or is there too much interest from third parties here that would want some level of involvement because of their own interests?
Well, you have the good third party meddling or interference or mediation, and then you have the really negative factors. And you outlined some of them. I think, as you said at the start of this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization showed its relevance. We know that Russia is obviously consumed by this terrible war in Ukraine and is no peacemaker. And certainly, I think, certainly on the Kyrgyz side, We've seen a lot of legitimate worry that Tajikistan and Russia's increasing closeness, at least rhetorically, may really certainly exclude Russia as a peacemaker here. But I think that what I think about first and foremost is we want a voice for the communities of these regions who, again, are very far away from their capitals. I'm talking about southern Kyrgyzstan and northern Tajikistan. They have to have a voice, and international human rights law says that these rights to land, right to water, these issues have to be taken into account. So we do have an international framework for this borderland, which is complicated. And I think that there has to be some, or I would hope that there would be a notion of shared sovereignty, but we want the OSCE and the UN. I would nominate both of those organizations to be involved here in monitoring what's going on.
Okay, Steve, I'm going to let you have the last word. Unfortunately, we're over time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.